All right, back for part 2. We left off with Socks looking into that bundle, and he figured out there was a live creature in there, but he doesn't know what it is yet. So let's get started. As Socks stared at the strange creature in the bundle and listened to its smack and snuffle, he began to understand. His owners, his faithful, loving owners, had brought home a new pet to threaten his position in the household. Socks turned his back and lashed his swollen tail. He was filled with jealousy and anger and a terrible anxiety. The Brickers might love the new pet more than they loved him. Oh no. Poor Socks, Mrs. Bricker stooped to smooth his fur, but Socks moved away from her hand. An unhappy wail came from the bundle. Oh dear, he can't be hungry already. The worry in Mrs. Bricker's voice was a new sound to Socks. He sure can, said Mr. Bricker as he sat down on the couch with the wailing bundle on his lap that had always belonged to Socks. Listen to him. You can tell he has a fine pair of lungs. Socks turned his back and began washing to pass the time until he made his mind how to regain the lap from the new pet. On her way to the kitchen, Mrs. Bricker spoke in her special voice, higher than her normal voice, and she always has used for her cat. I'm hurrying, she said. I'll have your bottle in a minute. Socks paused in his washing with one paw behind his ear until he understood what this time she was not speaking to him, a slight that hurt him almost as much as the loss of a lap. He scrubbed his paw back and forth against his nose until he could contain his longing for reassurance no longer. Alert and ready to run to the first sign of danger, Socks crept cautiously toward Mr. Bricker, who reached for the bottle his wife had brought from the kitchen and said, Let me feed him. You sit down and rest. Mrs. Bricker sat down, but she did not rest. Are you sure you want to feed him? She asked. Both parents spoke of the baby as he, as if he were a stranger whose name they had not caught. Nothing to it, Mr. Bricker offered the bottle to his son. Greedy smacks came from the bundle. Hey, look at him go, said the proud new father. Socks took a chance. He leaped to the center of the couch, cautiously set one paw on Mr. Bricker's knee, leaned forward, and sniffed a sweet, milky fragrance. Careful, Socks, warned Mr. Bricker. You can look, but you can't come too close. Socks stared at the tiny, wrinkled face with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and jealousy. He saw the baby open its eyes and raise one nightgown-covered fist, so he did not know it belonged to him. He saw the baby's head wobble and his eyes cross. Socks began to understand that the creature was not a pet, but a new kind of person, a person so small that he left room on the lap for a cat. Very well. They would share the lap, but his concession did not mean he liked the new person. Socks felt that half a lap was better than none. Socks put a second paw on Mr. Bricker's knee, and with his half-closed eyes, he began to knead and purr. Ouch! Both of Mr. Bricker's hands were occupied. Take your claws out of my leg! Socks found himself lifted by Mrs. Bricker and set on the floor without so much as a kind word. He resumed his washing to show his owners that he had business of his own to take care of. Let them attend to theirs. He would attend to his. He groomed his tail with long, hard rasps of his pink tongue. The baby's smacking changed to fussing, another sound new to Socks. He hoisted his hind legs and went to work on his toes while he observed all that was going on. Behind his hoisted leg, he could see Mrs. Bricker leaning anxiously over her baby. Maybe he needs to be burped, she said. Mr. Bricker held up the bottle. You're right, he's taken 2 ounces. He set the bottle on the table at the end of the couch, raised the baby to his shoulder, and began to pat its back. Still, the baby fussed. Mr. Bricker patted harder. Socks lowered his leg. There was plenty of room on the lap. No, better not risk reclaiming it so soon. He went on with his grooming, but he began to grow uneasy. He wanted the fretting to stop, the same way he wanted the ringing of the telephone or the buzzing of the doorbell to be silenced. Try rubbing instead of patting, suggested the anxious mother. The father rubbed. The fussing became a wail. Mr. Bricker rubbed the tiny back and Mrs. Bricker patted. Socks became so anxious to have the crying stop that he no longer could pay attention to his washing. "Maybe we don't pat the right way," said the mother. "How else can you pat?" The father was beginning to see that there was no more to feeding a baby than he had realized. Socks took a chance and leaped up to fill the lap, which was going to be wasted. Mrs. Bricker promptly returned him to the floor. Socks was deeply hurt. Filled with sorrow and longing, he lay down on the carpet with his chin on his white forepaw and stared into the black and empty fireplace. He yearned to be held and stroked and reassured. He longed to have his master hold and play with his tail, and Socks was the most particular about allowing people to play with his tail. With a deep sigh, Socks closed his eyes, but he did not sleep. His ears, moving like tiny radar screens, picked up every sound. "What are we going to do?" Mrs. Bricker sounded almost tearful. "If we don't get the air bubble up, his stomach will go on hurting, and he's too little to hurt." "Feeding a baby can't be this hard." The father no longer sounded confident. "The world is full of dumbbells who feed babies. How else do babies survive?" "Try putting him face down across your knee," suggested Mrs. Bricker. "I saw someone do that once." The radar ears caught the soft sounds of the baby being moved, followed by gentle patting. "Try rubbing," suggested the hovering mother again. Suddenly the baby belched. Startled, Socks raised his head and stared. The whole family was relieved, the baby, the mother, and the father, who were beaming at the miraculous thing their baby had done. Socks was relieved too, because at last the crying had stopped. "Charles William," Mrs. Bricker spoke to her accomplished son by name. "Oh, such a big noise from such a little fellow." "Attaboy," Mr. Bricker congratulated his son. "That's the old fight." The atmosphere of the room had changed from one of scared and anxiousness to one of joy, which Socks felt was his to share. This time he stood at Mr. Bricker's feet and looked up uncertainly, as if to say, "I'm part of the family too." The Brickers were too busy to notice. "Why, Charles William is asleep already," whispered Mrs. Bricker as she bent over to her son. "Here, let me take him. I'll put him down in his crib." Now, thought Socks, now with the new person out of the room, he would regain the lap. Before he could jump, however, Mr. Bricker picked up the bottle, which still held several ounces of the baby's formula, and started down the hall to the kitchen. Socks got there first, and he sat down beside the refrigerator. "See how patiently I am waiting beside our refrigerator?" his attitude seemed to say. Mr. Bricker unscrewed the top from the bottle. "Socks, it isn't time for you to eat," he said, and was about to dump the formula into the sink when Socks uttered such a wistful meow that he changed his mind. Mr. Bricker found a bowl, poured the formula into it, and carried it into the laundry, where his feet crunched into the kitty litter that Socks had scattered the night before. He set the bowl on the newspaper beside Socks's dish. Socks crouched and began to lap the sweet-smelling milk with his quick pig tongue. "Did you think we had forgotten you?" asked Mr. Bricker. Although Socks did not care to be interrupted while eating, this time he made an exception and gave his master a long stare that said, "How could you bring that new person into our house? Now you have spoiled everything." Sad and confused, Socks went back to lapping up the formula in his bowl. The warmth and sweetness of the milk comforted him. He lapped every drop, then licked the empty dish so hard that he moved it across the newspaper until it bumped the wall. Socks needed every drop of consolation he could get. His owners loved the baby more than they loved him. And that is the end of chapter 2. So Socks isn't feeling too good, is he? He's a little jealous that there's a new pet in the house, and that new pet is a baby. So we'll have to wait till tomorrow to find out what happens in chapter 3. Chapter 3 is called Socks and the Formula.